Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.0. In this video I'm going to cover story modularity, that is, ways of looking at the connections between passages within a story and how they can be organized in different ways. So to start, I've put together a simple three-passage connection here that I'll play for you. And we see we started with the beginning, and we have a link to another passage, and we have a link to a third passage, and there's some text here in the third passage. Now, if you notice, with each click, I also get a history. I can go back and go back all the way to the beginning of it. I can then go forward and go forward again. So for each passage transition, the history object within Twine was populated with an item so that I can go forward and I can go backwards. And that's generally how we think about stories in Twine. Connections between passages, very straightforward here. There's another way we can think about this, however, that instead of being directly connected, that is, with a link to another passage within each passage itself, we can also think about it and using an indirect connection. Instead of it showing up on this map here, the grid, connection between one passage to another, we can use the functionality built into Twine to create implicit instead of explicit connections between one passage to another. So instead of these three passages, I've now moved to the second column here, and I've just changed this to be a starting passage, another beginning. So if I start this time, so we see the text from a separate passage and then the text of a third disconnected passage. None of these are explicitly connected, however. Unlike the first column, they don't have links to another passage. However, the contents of each passage are showing up in this first one. In each case, I'm displaying the content of a separate passage and then the content of a third disconnected passage within the first passage. To do that, I'm using the display macro. I'm calling with the exact passage name in quotations. So display the content of a separate passage, then display the content of a third disconnected passage. And as you may have noticed, the history object was not populated. We didn't actually go forward to another passage or go back to another passage. This is still the same first passage. We just are able to display a separate passage and display a third disconnected passage. And this is just one of two techniques here I'm showing. This is the first one, in that you can separate a story into different parts, in different modules, if you will, of passages. So instead of it being a very explicit connection between one to another that a player can follow, you can programmatically create connections between passages using the display macro. So in each case, you can write content in a separate passage or write content in a third disconnected passage and have them both displayed within the first passage. So your story does not have to have, like I said, explicit connections. You can have implicit ones. And depending on how events go, if you have something random or the player does some event but doesn't do another event and different things are triggered, you can have your story programmatically rearrange itself instead of having very explicit go to this, go to this, go to this, which gives you a little more of a dynamic nature to the story. Now, the second way you can approach story modularity is instead of thinking in story chunks, that is, as I've had in the second column, a bit of story over here that's then displayed, or a bit of story over here that's then displayed, you can think about it in terms of mechanics instead of a narrative construction. So in this case, instead of having a direct link to another passage, I'm using the link macro to replace some text with the content of another passage. We're displaying on the link, on clicking the link, run what's in this right here. And so call the display macro, and display the content of a separate passage. And then again, if I click on this string of text, run what's in the brackets, and in this case, use the display macro to display the contents of the passage, a third disconnected passage. And then, using the set assignment macro, set the variable number var to the value 2, and then, just like before, when we click on the link, display the content of the passage, add 2 to number var, and then do it again. In practice, it looks like this. So we can click to include the contents of a separate passage, then click to include the contents of a third disconnected passage, as we had in the second column. That is, you can separate it as narrative discontinuity. Then if we use it as an approach to mechanics here, this is the second approach to story modularity. We can have number var be increased by 2 and number var be increased by 2. So what this is doing is calling a passage whose just sole purpose is to do some mechanical thing, some arithmetic in this case, where we're just setting number var to the value of number var plus the number 2. And so the passage add 2 to number var becomes, in a way, a function that we can call. Just like in mathematics, if you wanted to add something together, or use sine or cosine, you can feed it something, you can call it, and it will perform some action. So the two different approaches here to story modularity are disconnections and narrative, that is displaying some chunk of story here or displaying some other chunk, programmatically deciding which one to display, or on the events of some user doing something like pressing a key at a certain time or running out of time or something like that. And then a second approach here to viewing passages as not just chunks of story, but actually separate functions in a way, or separate ways to disconnect the mechanics, so that one passage does some small thing and another passage does some small thing. And it's not necessarily story driven. There's no narrative here, it's not text, but it's some mathematics or it's some function. And so you can call it using the same display macro, just like we did here. That when we click here to increase number var, it ran, that is, it displayed the contents of the passage add 2 to number var, which is just a way to separate the mechanics visually and programmatically in a way, so that we could understand it as a separate module, that this module does something and this module does something. Now it's not too terribly complicated, and it is actually pretty simple once you realize that you don't need to have explicit connections, you can have implicit ones. But in a way, it's also a little bit of a trick how you can design stories in Twine. That instead of having just a straight one to another passage, that you can have some pretty complex connections that aren't necessarily explicitly shown on the grid here when you first look at them. They can instead be decided at runtime or due to some user event. But those are just two ways to look at story modularity in Twine 2.0. Thanks for watching.